Hello, my name is Justin Haskins. Welcome to the show. Today's topic is going to be heat waves, climate catastrophes. Are we all about to die from the existential threat of climate change? That's the topic of today's show, and it is really, really important because, there's all these people that want to completely transform the entire global economy because of climate change and issues like heat waves. So we need to know, is this a real crisis or not? We're going to dive deep into the data, talk about some of the arguments in my recent article for foxnews.com. But before we do that, my name is Justin Haskins, and I appreciate you coming to the show, finding my channel on YouTube or the audio version, wherever you're listening to the show, wherever you're watching. Thank you for joining me. You can help me out. You can be part of the movement to save the United States of America, to promote pro-liberty, free market solutions, to talk about faith and morality in a way that is not exactly within the mainstream conversation that has completely infected the United States today. By supporting the channel, it doesn't cost you anything at all. All you have to do is like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment under this video. All of these things are going to help grow this channel. It's a new channel. I've been doing this for a very long time. I've been writing for foxnews.com for a long time, and Newsweek and The Hill and publications like that, The Federalist. I've been involved in all kinds of huge, massive projects like New York Times bestselling books with Glenn Beck, like Dark Future and The Great Reset, which came out in 2022 and 2023. I've been on TV and radio a whole bunch of hundreds of times, more than 300 times, but I've never had my own YouTube channel. This is the first time. So I'm asking, please help me out by subscribing to the channel, liking the video, leaving a comment. All of these things are going to help break through those big tech algorithms. All right, let's get to the topic at hand. It's a really important one. If you happen to be watching this in the summer of 2023, and you probably are if you're seeing this video, but you might be finding this later on, I don't know, you know that it's hot. It's been really hot this summer. We're having a particularly hot summer. And one of the things that has come out of this from the mainstream press is that we're facing a climate change catastrophe, and that this summer's heat waves, that's proof of it. That we're facing an existential threat. And what I want to do today is, I don't want to talk about temperature records and whether or not global warming is predominantly being caused by human beings or natural forces, or I don't want to talk about any of those things. What I want to talk about is specifically related to heat waves, because that's the thing that's getting all the attention in the news. And the data is so clear on this. It is so clear. What we're seeing right now with heat waves is not outside the ordinary from what we've seen historically related to heat waves. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. They can't possibly imagine that that's true, but the records themselves show it. Now, why is it then that we're seeing so many people in the media and elsewhere, politicians, say that this is obviously being caused by climate change? There's no doubt about it. Only a climate change science denier could ever possibly make the argument that climate change isn't the culprit, right? Only a science denier would say that. Well, the reason that they're saying that is typically because either they're dishonest, they have an ideological agenda or something like that, and they just don't care about the data. They haven't seen the data, or the data that they've seen has been cherry-picked to only show a trend that particular people want the public and reporters and others to see. And I'll show you exactly what I mean. Let's get right into it. I'm going to take you to the EPA website if you're watching the video version of the show. Let's pull that up right now. Okay, so this is the EPA's own website. This is official government data. You can see the EPA logo right up here. Let's see, climate change indicators, heat waves. All right, figure 1 shows various heat wave characteristics in the United States by decade from 1961 to 2021. All right, so we're seeing long-term trends in heat waves. Now, if the theory is true that climate change is causing catastrophic, massive heat waves, then the data should reflect that, because we've seen warming since 1961 to today. We've seen lots of warming happen, relatively speaking, lots of warming. Historically, it's not as much as people argue it is, but we've seen warming. We've seen lots and lots of CO2 emissions increase, according to a whole bunch of different scientists that claim that. But I don't think that the data shows that we've seen heat wave, sort of a catastrophic increase in the intensity or number of heat waves. So let's first look at figure 1 here. Now, this is beginning in 1961. Now, the reason that's important to keep in mind is that the 1960s, 1970s had very low temperatures. Okay. So if you start your charts in 1960s and the 1970s, what you see is a dramatic increase. It looks really, really steep. When you go further back in the temperature record and you start in the early 1900s or in the late 1800s, which is as far back as a lot of the data goes, you see a much longer term trend, an ebb and flow that looks like we're not seeing such a catastrophic increase. So, but even keeping that in mind, and I'm going to show you another chart that proves that point. But before we ever get to that, let's just look at this chart for figure 1. All right. What it shows is we've got 4 different charts here. We have heat wave frequency, heat wave duration, heat wave season, and heat wave intensity. And one of the things that you'll notice is that although some of these charts are very sneakily crafted to make it look like there's dramatic differences between these things, in reality, the differences between these decades is very, very small. So for example, let's take a look at heat wave duration. All right, so in this chart, heat wave duration, in the 1960s, there was an average length of individual heat wave days of 3. In 2020s, it went from 3 to 4. 4. So it increased by one day. From the 1960s to 2020s, it increased by 1 day. The average duration of a heat wave increased by 1 day. Okay? Now, that is an increase, and percentage-wise, that's a big increase, but in reality, is 1 day a crisis? No, it's not a crisis. Let's look at heat wave intensity. All right? Heat wave intensity is the average temperature above the local threshold during heat waves. Okay? So how much, so how intense the heat wave is, right? That's what we're looking at. In the 1960s, it was just below 2 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? Just below 2 degrees. By the 1980s, it had risen to just, maybe 2.2-ish or so. I'm looking at a bar graph here, so it's not exactly giving me specific figures or anything like that. 1990s, it's still below 2.5. 2000s, it's still below 2.5. 2010s, it jumped up to nearly 2.5, but not quite. And in the 2020s so far, and obviously there's still more years left in the 2020s, more than half of it is still left, it's actually lower than it was in 2010s. So the difference between the 1960s and 2020s, 60 years, is not even half a degree. Not even half a degree in terms of heat wave. And this is only the average temperature above the local threshold during heat waves. Okay, so we should, if this is a huge crisis, a big problem, that number you would think would be a lot larger, right? How about heat wave frequency? This is one of the most jarring parts of these 4 graphs included in figure 1 by the EPA, right? It's the average number of heat waves per year. Now, as I said before, it's really important to keep in mind that in the 1960s and 1970s, we had really low temperatures relative to the rest of the century. So you're not going to have a lot of heat waves, theoretically. That's what we saw. It's not theoretical. We saw in the record there are not a lot of heat waves. That's unsurprising because those decades were especially low when it came to temperatures over the last century. Now, what did we see during that period? We saw in the 1960s, there were a little over 2 on average number of heat waves per year. In the 1970s, it was almost 3. By the 1990s, it was up to 4. And in 2010s, it's 6. And now in the 2020s, it's also 6. So the difference between the 1990s and 2020s, so 30 years or so, depending on what you're talking about, 30 years is about 2 days. Now, I want you to ask yourself this question. Obviously, that's getting longer, right? According to this data, We're starting in the 60s, which is going to be problematic for people who take the opposite position of this, as I'll show you in a second. But even if we were to look at the 1960s and say this is a good starting point for data, and it isn't, we're only seeing 4 extra days of heat waves on average per year. Is that a crisis? I mean, just ask yourself that. In 30 years, it's increased by what, 2 days on average in 30 years? Is that incredibly problematic? Is that an existential crisis? I'm not asking you if this is in some way problematic. Okay. I'm asking you, is it a crisis? Because that's the way it's being treated by the media. All right. I think common sense answers that question. All right. Now I want to move on to a different one. Let's move on to figure number 3. We're not going to look at figure 2 only because I don't think it's, I don't find it particularly useful in terms of illustrating things. It's mostly focused on large U.S. cities, and there's all sorts of problems with relying only on temperature data from cities. And so I don't want to do that. What I want to do instead is look at the U.S. Annual Heat Wave Index. Also, by the way, figure 2, the other reason, it's not just about the cities. It's also the graphs that they use here, I didn't find to be particularly, the illustrations particularly, useful or easy to understand for a lot of people. So I'm just not going to go over it. All right. If you want to go to EPA.gov and look at climate change indicators and heat waves, you can find these figures for yourself. So figure 3, heat wave index. Now this one is really important. It's the only one out of all of them that didn't start in the 1960s. It goes back earlier in the temperature record to the 1890s. 1895 is the first year in the record. Now, what you'll notice, there's a bunch of things that you'll probably notice, but one of the biggest things you'll notice is that in the 1930s, beginning in late 1920s, in throughout the 1930s, all the way until you get towards maybe, 1937, 1938, somewhere in that range, there were lots and lots of heat waves, big heat waves. Okay. Now, why was the heat wave index off the charts in the 1930s? Well, because the 1930s were a really, really, really hot decade. In addition to that, in the United States, we had the Dust Bowl, certain agricultural practices and other things. And there are many scientists that believe that the agricultural practices that were used in the 1930s and really prior to that as well helped contribute to the heat wave problem that we saw in the 1930s. But the big thing that you got to take away, if you just look at temperature records from this period too, you'll see the temperatures were really high in the 1930s. The heat waves were really high in the 1930s. Even if you want to say, well, the index shouldn't be as high as it spiked in the 1930s, there's Dust Bowl and agricultural practices and other things. Okay, fine. Let's lower it. It's still going to be a really big spike in heat waves. Now, the 1930s that was almost a century ago, right? It was a long, long time ago. We had fewer carbon dioxide emissions. We had climate change was not a thing people thought of. It was just not on the radar at all. And yet they had massive, massive heat wave problem in the 1930s. You'll also notice that in the early 1900s, there was another heat wave spike that occurred right around the turn of the century. Huge heat wave spike. We also saw a heat wave spike in the late 1910s. We saw it in the mid 1950s. We see heat wave spikes right around 1980 and in the late 1980s as well. And as I mentioned earlier, in the 1960s and 70s, into the, not into the 1980s, but in the 1960s and 70s, you see there was a cooling period. And during that period of time, there were all these people talking about a global cooling catastrophe. And that occurred in the 1960s and 1970s. That's why I think it's really bad to start your data in the 1960s rather than, say, the 1950s or the 1940s or the 1930s, because if you did, it would make the graph look completely different, right? It would give you a completely different picture of how things turned out. So I think it's kind of dishonest to start in the 1960s because it will almost always show an increase in temperature no matter what happened, because it was so low in the 1960s and 70s that anything that happens after that is going to look like it's a dramatic increase in temperature. That was not a normal period of time, the 60s and 70s, for temperature. So I think it's dishonest to start your examination during that period. Now, you'll notice that there is, beginning in somewhere in the 1990s, maybe late 1990s, you see an upward trend in the number of heat waves, or in the heat wave index, rather. This isn't just number of heat waves. In the heat wave index, you see an upward trend. And there's no doubt about that. That's what the data shows. But the data also shows that we had really huge, massive heat wave problems in the early 1900s as well. From the 1900 to mid 1950s, 1955 or so, we had huge number of heat waves. In fact, from 1900 to 1955, you could argue heat waves were a much bigger problem than from the mid 1950s to today. That's what the data shows. This is the government data. This isn't some climate denier website or something like that. This is the actual government data illustrating that we don't have the crisis that so many people claim that we have. Okay? So if we don't see that, and there's other things we could point to as well. I wrote an article for Fox News called "It's Not Climate Change That's Causing Heat Waves This Summer," but no one wants to explain why. It was published on July 27th, so 2023. So if you want to take a look at that, just Google it. You can find it. There's other arguments that are made in here that show that if you actually start breaking down temperature records, extreme temperature records related to big variations in the temperature relative to sort of the standard, right? So if we're looking for really hot weather, and we break it down to the actual weather stations, what you'll find is that in much of the United States, there actually hasn't been higher than normal temperatures. There's actually been, in some cases, lower than normal temperatures. So it is, and I'm not talking about tiny little parts of the United States. I'm talking about massive swaths, like whole states. I mean, the data is really, really important. It's really interesting. And I think it's important that if you're going to get involved in this, you're going to get invested in the climate change debate on either side. You have a full accounting, a full understanding of all of the data and what it shows. So, as I said earlier, why, if the data is so clear that we're not seeing a heat wave crisis, do people allege that there's a heat wave crisis? I think, as I pointed out earlier, that there's a bias that exists there in the media and among politicians, people who want to transform the economy, who want to use the climate change crisis to usher in huge changes to the social contract, as people like John Kerry have said, who want the Green New Deal or some lighter version of it. As Joe Biden, the president of the United States, has claimed, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and the current vice president of the United States, Kamala Harris, have said, right? All of these people have endorsed these policies and ideas that involve massive transformations of the economy, society, social contracts, and all of it is using climate change as the justification for these things happening. Now, that doesn't mean that climate change isn't happening. And it also doesn't mean that humans aren't contributing to climate change. All right. Climate scientists, they have all sorts of opinions about this. There are a lot of climate scientists out there who believe that humans are not the primary cause of climate change. And there's a whole bunch of climate scientists out there who believe that humans are the primary driver of climate change and that natural variation is actually a smaller piece of the puzzle. And so I'm not a climate scientist and I'm not going to try to make those arguments. All I want you to do for right now, okay, is to just ask yourself, is there a heat wave crisis? Is there an existential crisis being caused by climate change? Is a few extra days of climate, of heat waves per year, is that justification for reworking the entire global economy? And I think that common sense, basic logic, you don't even need to be an ideologue one way or the other. Just common sense and basic logic says no. Of course, we shouldn't rework all of society and rewrite social contracts and spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars rebuilding an energy system that already works really well. We shouldn't do that based on a few extra days of heat wave duration and things of that nature. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be always striving for cleaner energy, for more affordable energy, for energy that is more reliable. We should always be looking for that. We should do everything we possibly can to have the cleanest, most reliable, most effective, most efficient, most the greatest wealth producing form of energy that we can. We need to balance all of these things: environmental concerns, economic concerns, supply concerns. Foreign policy is related to all of this, of course. We should be producing our energy domestically whenever possible. All of these things need to be built into the equation, right? But the people who say, and there are lots of them, that heat waves and other things, we could have done a whole bunch of videos on, or we could have spent a whole bunch of time in this video on other kinds of extreme weather events that's supposedly hitting the world, like hurricanes and other things. The people who point to those things as examples, as dire warnings of the world descending into some sort of post-apocalyptic hellscape in the near future, I don't think that they're being honest with you, or in some cases, I think that they just are not looking at the data themselves carefully. I really, truly, honestly believe that. There are people who are going to see this video and think that I'm, just full of crap and that I'm biased and all of this other stuff. But I assure you, it really isn't that. It really isn't. I used to be, when I was in college and in high school, I used to be one of these people who believed that this was a huge crisis. And I didn't change my mind about it because, I started getting money from some big rich donor or something. And then that forced me to change my mind on all these issues. That's not what happened at all. The reason I don't think climate change is a crisis is because that's what the data seems to show. That doesn't mean it won't become a crisis at some point in the future. Maybe it will. But right now, I don't think we have very good data to suggest that that's going to be the case. And I don't think the things that are supposedly a crisis right now, like heat waves, are really a crisis. And I think the evidence illustrates that. So what I want is a balanced, logical, dispassionate look at the scientific data. Let's let the scientists debate the temperature record and the best ways of making sure that the temperature record is accurate, and climate models and all of that stuff. And let's come to the best conclusion that we possibly can as a society and as a world on this, because it is really important debate that we're having. But the idea that we're in the midst of some catastrophic descent into a catastrophe, or the catastrophic descent into hell, this idea that we're all going to die, which is what an existential threat to humanity really means. When you say that climate change is an existential threat, that means that we're at risk of being wiped out. That's what it means when you say that. Do I think that the data supports that? No. No. And I don't think any honest climate scientist, even the ones that really believe that climate change is extremely dangerous, I don't even think most of them would say, oh yeah, we're all at risk of dying, or that heat waves have increased so dramatically that, it's an existential threat. I just don't think anybody really believes that who's actually looked at the data. But at any rate, I think this is important stuff. If you're interested in learning more about this information, I'm going to include some links in the show notes so that you can track down this information yourself, see for yourself, in case you want to verify anything that I said or you want to look up more information. I would urge you not to just look at one side or the other. Look at all the available evidence. Look at all of the arguments. Don't just look at the information that I provide. Do your own homework. Don't take anything for granted, because there are so many biased people in this space. It is very, very frustrating. And that goes for both sides. There are biased people on both sides. But to be totally honest, yeah, I do think that the climate alarmists out there, and there are many of them, are on average more biased and and act in a way that I think is really kind of unscientific in a lot of cases. And I think that they are worse offenders than people who are sort of skeptical of this established narrative that we're all going to die from climate change. I think those people, in my experience, tend to be more informed about a lot of these things, and they tend to be more careful in the conclusions that they reach. That's not always the case, which is why I said you should do your own homework and go straight to the source. But it is, in many cases, the situation. And it's unfortunate. It really is, because this should be about science. And in a lot of ways, it isn't. All right. That's it for today's show. Thank you for joining me. Again, my name is Justin Haskins, and I'll see you next time.